So good evening. This is the first full session of this semester's Myra Kraft Open Classroom, which is meant for the better part of a decade to bring the kind of discussion and discourse that takes place within Northeastern as an academic institution to a wider public. And tonight we are particularly fortunate in having four groups of students gathered, graduate students in public policy, honors students who are among our undergraduate students, journalism students, and then a group of sociology students who are being taught by Professor Tiffany Joseph. We're doing this joint class tonight because this initial opening session of the Myra Kraft portion of the open classroom is focused on issues of race, anti-Semitism, anti-Asian hate crimes, anti-Latinx crimes, and we need to expand the discussion and the conversation around those. Should I give the warning or will you? We're going to start tonight's class with a TED-Talk presentation that was given fairly recently. And within that TED-Talk, there are depictions of violent scenes and racist scenes, which may be disturbing to some people who are a part of our audience tonight. And so that TED Talk runs for about 8 minutes, 7 or 8 minutes. And we alert you to that now so that if you are likely to find the material offensive, we would encourage you to tune out for about 10 minutes and then come back and join us for Professor Joseph's presentation and our classroom discussion. And having microphone over to my teaching peer, Professor Jonathan Kaufman. Jonathan?
Okay, thank you, Ted. So we're going to start the video now, and then when it's over, we'll turn things over to Professor Joseph to lead our conversation.
I collect objects. I collect branding irons that were used to mark slaves as property. I collect shackles for adults and restraints for adults as well as children. I collect lynching postcards. Yes, they depict lynchings. They also depict the massive crowds that attended these lynchings. And they are postcards. They were also used for correspondence. I collect pro-slavery books that portray Black people as criminals or as animals without souls. I brought you something today. This is a ship's branding iron. It was used to mark slaves, or they were not slaves when they were marked. They were in Africa, but they were marked with an S to designate that they were going to be slaves when they were brought to the US and when they were brought to Europe. Another object or image that captured my imagination when I was younger was a Klan robe. Growing up in South Carolina, I would see Ku Klux Klan rallies occasionally, actually more than occasionally. And those memories of those events never really left my mind, and I didn't really do anything with that imagery until 25 years later. A few years ago, I started researching the Klan, the 3 distinct waves of the Klan. The second one in particular, the second wave of the Klan had more than 5 million active members, which was 5% of the population at the time, which was also the population of New York City at the time. The Klan Robe factory in the Buckhead neighborhood of Georgia was so busy, it became a 24-hour factory to keep up with orders. They kept 20,000 robes on hand at all time to keep up with the demand. As a collector of artifacts and as an artist, I really wanted a Klan robe to be part of my collection because its artifacts and objects tell stories. But I really couldn't find one that was really good quality. What is a black man to do in America when he can't find the quality Klan robe that he's looking for? So I had no other choice. I decided I was going to make the best quality Klan robes in America. These are not your traditional Klan robes you would see at any KKK rally. I used kente cloth. I used camouflage, spandex, burlap, silks, satins, and different patterns. I make them for different age groups. I make them for young kids as well as toddlers. I even made one for an infant. After making so many robes, I realized that the policies the Klan had in place, or wanted to have in place 100 years ago, are in place today. We have segregated schools, neighborhoods, workplaces. And it's not the people wearing hoods that are keeping these policies in place. My work is about the long-term impact of slavery. We're not just dealing with the residue of systemic racism, it's the basis of every single thing we do. Again, we have intentionally segregated neighborhoods, workplaces, and schools. We have voter suppression. We have disproportionate representation of minorities incarcerated. We have environmental racism. We have police brutality. I brought you a few things today. The stealth aspect of racism is part of its power. When you're discriminated against, you can't always prove you're being discriminated against. Racism has the power to hide, and when it hides, it's kept safe because it blends in. I created this robe to illustrate that. The basis of capitalism in America is slavery. Slaves were the capital in capitalism. The first Grand Wizard in 1868, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was a Confederate soldier and a millionaire slave trader. The wealth that was created from chattel slavery, that's slaves as property, would boggle the mind. Cotton sales alone in 1860 equal $200 million. That would equal $5 billion today. A lot of that wealth can be seen today through generational wealth. Oh, I forgot the other crops as well. You have indigo, rice, and tobacco. In 2015, I made one robe a week for the entire year. After making 75 robes, I had an epiphany. I had a realization that white supremacy is there, but the biggest force of white supremacy is not the KKK. It's the normalization of systemic racism. There was something else I realized. The robes had no more power over me at all. But if we, as a people, collectively, look at these objects, branding irons, shackles, robes, and realize that they are part of our history, we can find a way to where they have no more power over us. If we look at systemic racism and acknowledge that it's sewn into the very fabric of who we are as a country, then we can actually do something about the intentional segregation in our schools, neighborhoods, and workplaces. But then and only then can we actually address and confront this legacy of slavery and dismantle this ugly legacy of slavery. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This is Professor Tiffany Joseph. And if you have any questions in the room, you can raise your hands and we'll bring a microphone to you. And out there in the broadcast world, you can submit questions through the Q&A function, and we'll be monitoring that and we'll read your question.
Thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Professor Kaufman, Professor Landsmark, for the invitation to be a part of this wonderful opportunity in the open classroom to dialogue with you on some of these really important topics at this particular time. My name is Professor Joseph. I'm an associate professor in the sociology department, and I also have an appointment in the international affairs program at Northeastern. And a lot of my research is really centered around looking at intersections between race, ethnicity, immigration, public policy, and health, and how all of those things have an impact on people in the United States, but also thinking about those issues globally and comparatively. Tonight, I'll be talking with you about some readings from a graduate seminar in sociology in the sociology department that I'm teaching. And when I received the invitation from Professor Landsmark to be here tonight, I basically said the only way that I can make this work is if I can somehow bring my students to the class and have that be a part of the discussion. So I really appreciate the flexibility and the opportunity to bring my students to be a part of this experience. So what I'll be doing tonight is talking for a few minutes around some really important readings around current theories and debates in the sociology of race and ethnicity. And where appropriate, I'll be connecting that to some of the readings that you all had for your class tonight. And so basically, I've organized my comments around three themes. The first one is really thinking about the importance of the work of W.B. Du Bois for the development of social scientific scholarship on race and racism in the 20th century. And also the relevance of that work now, today, over 100 years later. And so I'll start by talking briefly about his work, The Souls of Black Folk, which was one of his pivotal works and one of the most foundational, because he argued that the problem of the 20th century is the color line in the United States. And a lot of times we think of the color line in the United States as Black and white, and also as something that's specifically based in the US. But Du Bois, actually for his time, was already thinking about these global processes of race and racism and how they tie into notions of capitalism and other systems of oppression that exist. And when he wrote of the color line, he was talking about the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Africa, in Asia, in America, and the islands of the sea. So he was thinking about the color line from a much broader perspective, even though a lot of the work, or this particular work of his, The Souls of Black Folk, focused on the experiences and the impact of anti-Black racism, overt government-sanctioned, de jure legal racism and discrimination at that time. And so his work at that time, or in that particular topic, and his broader scholarship has really been pivotal for really understanding the centrality of race in the United States and how it has contributed to unequal outcomes in the past and how that legacy continues to remain with us in the present. That book is also important because this is where Du Bois outlined his theory of double consciousness, and I saw that it was written on the board, so it looks like you all might have been discussing that earlier. And so that as a theory is really important to think about too within the context of race and racism, because for Du Bois, he's arguing that Black Americans, as a consequence of racism, are living behind the veil of racism, and that it really separates them from the larger American or US society. And so for Du Bois, this veil serves two functions. One function is that it covers the eyes of Black Americans, and it really shapes their view of the larger society. So they recognize that they're a part of the society or they're in the society, but not fully of the society. And then the veil also affects how Black Americans see themselves too. So that's why it's called double consciousness. It really has this impact not only on the way that Black Americans see themselves and how they see the larger society, but also how Black Americans are viewed through the lens of the larger society. And so this particular aspect of Du Bois's work has often been cited and discussed and debated among various scholars in different various fields. And in terms of thinking about the readings assigned for the open classroom tonight by Kendi, Berlin, Taylor, and Whitaker, I feel like this is a common thread that connects the open classroom readings tonight around the experiences of anti-Black racism and the impact of that on Black Americans. And so you all talked about the Kendi work, or you were talking about it as I came into class earlier. And in terms of thinking about how to be an anti-racist, like Du Bois, Kendi connects this racism to economic and political processes that are central to the establishment and the prosperity of the United States and its intersection with other types of oppression. And so I think it's also important too, his mention of the assimilationist model of white people as a superior standard in the United States is really important too when we start to think about contemporary discussions of immigration in the United States and who is considered to be fit to be an American or worthy of being an American. And certainly within the last couple of weeks, we've been hearing about immigration and race through what's been happening to Haitian migrants and at the southern border in Texas, who've been basically, some of whom were deported, a good number of them were. And then also a number of African refugees at the same time being welcomed into the United States. So really continuing to think about or add the notion of of migration and citizenship in terms of what it means to be an American, who's eligible for citizenship, and how this connects on to ideas around race and racism as well. And in a recent publication of mine, I argue that in terms of thinking about the relevance of Du Bois for the 21st century, that his insights on double consciousness, we can think about applying the intersection of race with documentation status and citizenship to more fully be able to understand what's happening in the 21st century and the centrality of race and racism through discussions and policy around immigration, naturalization, who's able to come to the US, who's more likely to be deported, caught up in the deportation regime, and then how that has an impact on people view and experience life in the United States. And so similarly, in terms of thinking about this notion of migration, the Berlin reading for tonight talks about 4 important migrations that are really relevant to understanding the African in America experience from the 17th to the 20th centuries. And so what I think is really important about all of the readings tonight, and particularly the Berlin reading, is really the importance of understanding the role that history continues to play in the present. So whenever I teach classes on race, whether it's with undergrads or either the graduate seminar, I teach them from a historical perspective because I think it's important for students to understand that the issues that we're grappling with today in the United States didn't just get here. These aren't issues that developed in the last decade or the couple of decades. And my students often ask me, well, why are we still talking about these issues? Or if we get rid of race and racial categories, maybe we'll get rid of racism. And my answer to students when they ask me those questions is we really have to think about history because this is a project that has been centuries in the making, and it's not going to be undone within the 50 or so years since the civil rights movement occurred. You're not going to be able to undo centuries of manifestations of racism and white supremacy embedded in policy and structures and institutions in a matter of decades. And it's important to understand the history because the history very much is connected to the present in terms of how we're living in that legacy now in the present with regard to racism. And specifically, the focus of anti-Black racism, which I also found to be a really common theme in the readings for tonight. So one of the other things that I just wanted to mention too in terms of another theme, following from Du Bois and the centrality of race and racism in the 20th century and thinking about the 21st century, is also the importance of thinking about race and racism from a global or a comparative lens, rather than solely essentializing the US context as the primary one or the one that's often thought of as the global model of racism. And so because a lot of my work has been international or comparative, I spent time in Brazil and the Dominican Republic and other countries looking at issues of race and how social constructions of race change based on the context that you're living in. But I've also been interested in understanding if you immigrate to the US from a place like Brazil or the Dominican Republic, the conversations around who is Black, who's white, who's racially mixed or what have you, varies very much compared to the United States. Even in my own experience, depending on the language that I'm speaking, how I'm wearing my hair, I'm racialized in very different ways, depending on what country I'm in and sometimes what part of the United States I'm in. And so it's really important to understand how these systems of race function, not only in the context of the United States, but also are embedded in global processes too regarding white supremacy, capitalism, and the important role of the power of the United States in contributing to this sort of global process around race and racism as well. And so in terms of going back to Du Bois and thinking about his work on the global color line, another scholar in recent years has published an article, Katrina King, arguing that much of the work that Du Bois has done has often been examined or interpreted from a domestic or US frame. But she argues that we really need to be thinking more about the global implications of Du Bois's work. And this is really important because much of the theories and the race regarding race, racism, anti-racism, hate, and other manifestations of racial and ethnic animus have been rooted in the US experience. And so as Du Bois conceived of the color line as global, many of his other works, Color and Democracy, The World in Africa, and others really articulate the interrelated and international processes connected to colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and how these have intersected with race and racism to create a global form of white supremacy that have enriched former colonizing or imperial countries that we often think of now as the global North or Western or higher income countries, and countries that have historically been predominantly white. But at the same time, the impact of these systems have had a negative impact in countries that were former colonies, many of which comprise what we think of now are called global South countries, or lower and middle income countries with predominantly people of color. And when we think about the role of migration, oftentimes in the current context, a lot of the immigration or migration that's happening internationally is of people of color coming from global South countries to global North countries, countries that have been negatively impacted by these processes of racism, capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, and their home countries being negatively impacted by that, so much so that the only option left to do in many cases is to migrate. And so it's important to think about how all of these processes also become important for thinking about the discussion and the manifestations of race and racism, how people get racialized, the categories that are created and developed, to categorize and classify people from different countries as they are on the move. And then the other thing that's really important to think about is often the U.S. has represented this global model of explicit government sanctioned de jure and de facto racism and white supremacy. And so because of that history, it's important, and it's understandable that the U.S. context becomes the basis for so much of this work and this scholarship that we read about and engage with in the social sciences and in various disciplines. But it's also important to really think about how this notion of the U.S. as this global model of racism has meant that in other countries where racism looks a little bit different, that people assume racism doesn't exist. And so this often seems to be the case in countries that are often perceived to be more racially mixed, where it seems like there are more cordial interracial interactions, higher levels of interracial marriages. And so I'm thinking particularly of countries like Brazil and in other parts of the Americas that are thought of, or at one point were thought of as racial utopias or racial paradises compared to the United States. But when you scratch the surface and really start to look at the manifestation of racial inequality, you also find that a similar dichotomy or hierarchy exists, where individuals who are racialized as whiter or lighter are at the top of the racial hierarchy and the top of the economic and political structure, and the people who are racialized as darker or blacker are at the bottom of that hierarchy, and individuals who are racially mixed or maybe have other racial or ethnic backgrounds sometimes serve as buffer groups in between those two groups. And so the other thing that's important to think about in this discussion is that even in countries where they've tried to remove race or racism from these sorts of discussions of national discourse, and they don't collect race data. So I'm thinking of countries like France, for instance. Doing away with race and racial categories actually does not remove the effects or the implications of racism or the racial and ethnic-based disparities that exist in those societies. And so it's really important to really think about this global color line from that perspective in terms of Du Bois, but also other scholars who've been arguing that we really need to think about these issues from a more global perspective. So I reference Katrina Kassimbing-King and also sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who talks about these models or different models for thinking about hierarchies of race within the context of the US and other countries. And lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about the importance of bringing in other perspectives and processes. And so in terms of the US context, there's a lot of focus on the experience of anti-Black racism. And because of the extent and the duration of that and the history of that, it makes sense and it's understandable that a lot of the focus of the research and the scholarship is on that experience. But we also have to bring other voices into the mix too and make sure that as the demographics of the United States shifts quite significantly, that other populations' experiences with race and racism are also incorporated as well. And so, for instance, one of the things that I think is really important is to make sure that we're highlighting the experience of Indigenous peoples as well, in terms of thinking about what could be considered the original sin of the era of discovery or European colonization was the displacement and genocide of Indigenous peoples in the Americas and beyond. And though those populations are less visible because of the impact of that genocide, Native Americans and other Indigenous peoples continue to feel the harmful effects of racism and this racial project, or these global projects of race, class, and colonial imperial domination. And in the context of COVID-19, we also really have to give attention to the experience of anti-Asian discrimination and the vilification that that population has experienced too within the United States, because it serves as another reminder that Asian Americans, many of whom have very deep generational ties to the United States, are perceived as what Mia Tuwan calls, quote unquote, forever foreigners. And so despite having been in the US for many, many generations, they're often thought of as not fully belonging or still as threats to the country. So despite being referred to as a model minority at times to disparage the lack of social mobility among Black and Latinx Americans. Asian Americans have also been perceived as threats and sometimes as enemies of the state, contributing to laws that have excluded them from immigrating to the United States, naturalizing as citizens, and also some of them having been imprisoned in internment camps by the US government in World War II. And so again, this history in terms of thinking about the experiences of African Americans was also happening alongside the exclusion of other groups in the United States as well. And I think that's important to focus on or remember as well in terms of thinking about some of the readings that my class had to do for this week. And lastly, in terms of thinking about individuals of Latinx descent, it's important to remember that they are not recent arrivals to the United States either. And so the history is important because those populations have been in this country for a very, very long time too, dating back to the Mexican-American War, when parts of the US, like California, used to be a part of Mexico, but also the impact of US military intervention in war that contributed to some contexts like Puerto Rico, for instance, becoming territories of the United States, and that some, in the case of Puerto Rico, continue to be territories of the United States. And so our discussions of race and racism really need to take into account these various events and be a part of our theorizing and our discussions about the role of race in the contemporary United States and how it is connected to the present, as some of the final readings that I had my class read this week by Tanya Golash-Bosa and Leanne Bean also demonstrate. So with that, I'll close on my comments and take your questions, and I look forward to discussion with you tonight.
Thank you very much for your presentation. While you were talking about migration, I just kept thinking about it because I'm shy. It's something I've been thinking about for a couple of months now, even in terms of language. So, for the lack of a better way to put it, when white people move to other countries, they're called expatriates. But when Black people move to other countries, they're forever labeled as immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there are many Black people or even other people of color that were born in the US. And when they meet people and people ask them, oh, where are you from? And they say, oh, I'm American. And they say, oh, no, where are you really, really from? So it's something that I've been thinking about because a few months ago, I found myself in a table of, I think, 2 Greeks, an American, and myself, a Nigerian. And we were talking, and I guess this is like my emotions that I have to walk through. And then I realized that one of the Greeks was a Greek. Another of the Greek person was a Greek American. And the American was an American. And while they were talking, it seemed sort of fashionable because, okay, their citizenship could not be traced to generations ago, or it couldn't be traced to generations ago. But I just felt a sense of discomfort. Like it was fashionable and sort of socially acceptable for them to move to other countries and they'll be known as expatriates. But if I myself say, oh, the economic situation of my country doesn't favor me, I want to move, better opportunities, I will forever be labeled as an immigrant. And if eventually I were to get a second passport and I do something like I break the law, I will quickly be reminded that I am Nigerian. Mm-hmm. Take, for example, Eurovision. No, not Eurovision. There was this sports events that had happened in Europe sometime over the summer. And a Black player had missed the goalpost. He did not score. And the next day, he had so many racist attacks. And it was, go back to your country, go back to your country. But when you succeed, your identity is quickly hyphenated. You are a Nigerian American. But when you do something bad, please, no, no, no. You're a Nigerian. So it's just something that I have been thinking about. And yeah, I appreciate the fact that you spoke about it, migration and the language in your presentation. And also, finally, even in terms of racism, the UK currently passed a law that COVID vaccines that have been administered in all African countries, some South American countries, and some other countries of the world are not recognized. So if I were to get vaccinated in Nigeria now and I want to travel to UK, I have to quarantine for 14 days. Like I have not been vaccinated simply because I received the vaccine on the continent. But where are these vaccines coming from? They're being given to us. So it's been a source of conflict for me as to why even African leaders themselves have not spoken about it. Like, why are these laws being brought up? What is the rationale behind it? So that's just what I've been thinking about.
All right, thank you for those comments. And I think basically, they exemplify a couple of things, and I won't go into too much detail about because I want everybody to take more questions. But I'll just quickly say that in terms of thinking about citizenship and immigration policy in the US and a number of other countries, that's also been racialized throughout much of US history, and that continues into the present. And so much so that it's synonymous that often people, when they hear the word American or European, those terms are racialized implicitly, and there's a presumption that, to be American means to be white, or to be British means to be white. So when you encounter someone who is American or British or what have you, that is not white, it's sort of a cognitive dissonance, and this perception that you don't really fully belong. So going back to what I was saying about the experience of Asian Americans being perceived as forever foreigners, other groups of people of color have also experienced something similar too. And I'll just stop there just in the interest of time to make sure that we can take some additional questions.
So I know you said that in the US, you noticed like differences with, I guess, race acknowledgement, like inside the US, like the South or the Northeast or whatever. I'm guessing not so much in the Dominican Republic because it's so small, but like, would you say there was that same sort of pronunciation in Brazil? Like, was there a difference between, I don't know, like Sao Paulo and Rio?
And difference in terms of?
I guess just the way, like, what you're talking about with way like race were perceived, or just general like perceptions and stuff like that.
So, I mean, I would certainly say from my experiences living and doing research in Brazil, that Brazil is a very large country, just like the United States. So people's experiences with race and racism can vary depending on the part of the country. But the racial demographics of the country also are different based on where you are in the country. So for instance, like Salvador da Bahia, which was one of the largest slave ports in the Americas, the population there today is still where the largest percentage of Afro-Brazilians or Brazilians who identify as Black live within Brazil. And it's no surprise that the social indicators in Bahia are, in terms of access to education, income, all of those social outcomes in that part of the country are much lower compared to, let's say, Sao Paulo in southern Brazil, where a larger segment of the population classifies as white. So, the geography of race also maps onto this too, in terms of thinking about the demographics and, again, the legacy of colonialism, of slavery, and how that continues to impact the people living today in different parts of Brazil. And we could also argue in other parts of the Americas too.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he argues that Black people and by extension, other people of color can be racist, contrary to the popular argument that if you are of a marginalized racialized group, you can't be racist because you don't have the power. So I was wondering if you agree or if you don't.
So that's a good question. And that's often, or I get versions of that question when I teach my undergraduate classes on race. And one of the things that I explain to students in terms of responding to that question is that in terms of living in a highly racialized society like the United States, we're all taking in all these messages from the media, all of these things that we're socialized around, negative stereotypes about various groups, including our own. And it is very possible for people to act on those in implicit and explicit ways. Now, with regard to racism, which is often, discussed as you meant, as having a power component to it, I go back to the example of thinking about, let's say, for example, a Black person or a person of color that is a police officer, for instance. So if we even think about, think about the George Floyd, the officers involved in that. And I believe 2 of them were people or are people of color. And so in terms of thinking about the fact that they were working in institutions, in terms of in law enforcement, and in that capacity were representing that institution and doing that job, or that contributed to, or that played a role in George Floyd's murder. That is an example of how, in particular roles, people of color can be representatives of power and use that power in acting towards other people of color, even though they're members of marginalized groups. And so I would say, using an example like that, or in the context of an example like that, that it is possible for a person of color to be racist in terms of if you are in a position of power or have been given some sort of power within law enforcement, or let's say you're making hiring decisions, or you have some sort of institutional power within an organization where you can actively discriminate against people, even if you are a member of that group, then I do believe it is possible to be racist because you are a representation of that power depending on the institution that you are working in, if that makes sense.
Hello. First of all, thank you for your presentation. Really cool to hear, particularly about the points of the globalist perspective of racism and those hierarchies that exist. I think we've seen over the past couple of years with the rise of social media and different online fora, we both have more information at our fingertips than we could ever need, as well as connections. And I'd be curious to hear your perspectives on if you believe social media and these sort of online fora have helped with dialogues of race or maybe hindered them. Now everybody has a say, including those that may not necessarily have the context or information to speak on it, but we also have access to more perspectives, particularly those outside of our own geography. So I'd love to hear any perspectives or comments you have on that.
Sure. So, I think one of the things about social media is that, it's very powerful in the sense that more people have access to it, to these forms of communication to be able to get into these dialogues. And so I think it's important for us to be able to have discussions and dialogues around issues of race and racism, because I think that's the only way that we will be able to, talk about these issues. But I will say that there's certainly, as you mentioned, there needs to be that it helps if people are informed about these topics before just kind of jumping into the fray. And I really think in terms of thinking about the educational system in the US, that we don't have more classes and discussions around race for students and adults, or for people in this society to be able to gain the tools and the language that they need to discuss this. So I'm a college professor. I've been teaching race classes for the last 10 years. And my students always say when they get to my class, I've never talked about these issues before. And I feel like it's problematic to get to age 18, at least in the United States, and to not be able to define race, racism, ethnicity, white supremacy, and to not have been given a language or the tools to be able to have dialogues around those issues, because I think it's important to have some common foundations for that terminology in order to be able to have dialogues about those topics, to be able to create true societal transformative change. If people don't have that foundation, it makes it really difficult to be able to engage in conversations that are going to be productive because people are coming at it from different angles. So for instance, recently there's been a lot of debate around critical race theory and some attempts to ban it in like elementary schools. But critical race theory is something that's taught in law schools. But I think the issue that, is really concerning about that debate is, the concern is trying to wrap discussions around race in general within this concept of critical race theory. So any discussion of race or racism or of difference or disparities in our society, not having that exist, I think is really problematic because again, if we aren't able to come together to talk about these issues and the impact that it's having on different segments of the population, it will be very difficult, I think, to move forward and to be able to work to become an anti-racist society, in terms of bringing it back to the Kendi book. So I really think that social media can be a way to generate conversation, but I really think the conversations could be even more powerful if people were more informed about the terminology being used to discuss and have those conversations.
So you mentioned getting kids in when they come to your class in college at the age of 18, not having the foundation to be able to have the conversations you'd like to have with them, or potentially being their first time being exposed to certain ideas or to have these conversations about race, which it can be, I guess, surprising that it's their first time really engaging with these issues. So how would you like to see that foundation built in situations where kids aren't necessarily getting that exposure? What do you think realistically could be done in order to build that foundation so that by the time they get to your class, there's a bit more of a common base to go off of?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it would certainly be, great and probably impactful for students to have exposure to what could be considered racial literacy classes. Probably at least starting in middle school. And the reason that I say that is because in terms of social psychology, adolescence is a really key time and development for people when they're really trying to figure out who they are in terms of their identities in various ways and sort of who they are as social beings in the social world. And so issues of race and ethnicity start to be very prevalent for people at that stage in their lives. And so if, there were, classes in middle school on, again, just getting the basics and what these terms mean and learning more about the history of the United States. And when I say history, I don't mean like a sanitized version of history, but really starting to, grapple with, again, the history of this country from the very beginning and the foundation of it being rooted in Native American genocide, the enslavement of African descended peoples, and a system, economic and political system that thrived on that. And so, even thinking about our current government and the Constitutional Convention, it was all tied to, the way our House of Representatives are apportioned and senators, all of that in the present is tied to the founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, where there were no women in the room, no lower income people, no people of color in that room making those decisions, setting up our democracy. And so I think it's really important for students to understand that from a young age to better be able to see the connections between what is happening now and how that's a legacy of what came before, rather than, oftentimes you hear comments where people say, oh, well, we had the civil rights movement to get rid of, racial discrimination. Why are Black Americans still complaining? Or why is this group doing that? Or why are we still revisiting these issues of race and racial inequality? And I think those comments get made because people don't understand the centuries that it took to get to this point and how it's going to take more than a few decades to undo the centuries of race making and the institutions built on white supremacy and inequality in this country. So I think that's where the education piece really comes in for students to really be able to understand as students and then as adults coming into the society why what we're seeing is not so new and why this is the next iteration and a long legacy of dealing with racial inequality in this country.
Um, Dr. Joseph, as always, you're phenomenal. I think my question is basically like, I guess, how is assimilation being understood? I think kind of to get back to the questions of like migration. Bean, for example, in one of our readings for today, discusses this, it's like this changing color line essentially where mixed race like Latinx and Asian children are like are being included in whiteness. And I guess I'm wondering if that's what the nuances, I guess, of that are, because in some ways it seems more like deputizing POC, like allowing, like, for like you bring up the example of George Floyd's murderers, and though, like, if those people of color had not served their purpose, they would have been kicked to the curb like any other POC. So I guess I'm wondering how, what it's like when POC are essentially like a function as like vassals. Like I'm thinking even about like on the African continent, like how the US, like the impacts of like the US and of other like Western nations in politics, in state decisions and how resources are distributed. And again, though, people come, to the US because of the effects of those decisions. And it feels like the only way to make it in the US is to essentially let go of any ideas of justice or progress for people, and to do things the way that white people have done them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
I'm just assimilation.
Sure. So I think your question was, getting at 2 points. And the first thing I want to say is that the article that you're referring to by Lee and Bean about the changing color line, it was published in 2012. And so I think if Lee and Bean had an opportunity to update that article, they probably would. And so I think this kind of goes a little bit to the discussion earlier when we were coming in, where you were talking about Obama and how his presidency at one point signaled, or people thought we were moving into a post-racial America where racial boundaries were becoming more fluid. And the Lee and Bean article was basically saying that with the shifting demographics, that there seems to still be, at least at the time that they wrote this article, more social distance between Black Americans and everybody else. And that white Americans and Latinxes and Asian Americans and multiracial individuals were socially closer to each other, or there was less social distance in terms of looking at indicators like rates of interracial marriage and how people racially identify too when they're multiracial, with Black, white multiracials being more likely to identify as Black, and Latinx, white, and Asian American and white multiracials more likely identify as white. I think I would say that in terms of thinking about how the socio-political context around race has changed in the last 9 years, that is probably not the case anymore, or not to the same extent, at least in terms of what we're hearing about the census, the most recent census numbers. but also in terms of thinking about under the Trump era and the resurgence of overtly racist rhetoric and policy geared towards anyone who wasn't white. So for individuals, who might have thought that they were getting closer to or assimilating to whiteness, it was a sort of the Trump presidency, I think, was a reminder of you're still not white in this country. And if we think about, again, the vilification of Asian Americans, the rise in anti-Asian discrimination in the context of COVID-19, and certainly how contentious immigration has been in terms of the racializing of immigration as a Latinx issue and the profiling that happens in law and immigration for individuals who are racialized or perceived to be Latinx, is certainly an indicator that that social distance that Lee and Bean were writing about in 2012 is certainly not as minimal as they hypothesized or discussed then. The other thing I'll just quickly say too about your last comment about thinking about the context of Africa and other countries and these global processes with regard to thinking about foreign policy of the U.S. and of countries in power, again, that have historically been, and some of which are still predominantly white, having the global power to basically impact or affect, what's happening in these other countries that in some cases were former colonies, where there were military interventions, and how that also had an impact on the racialization of individuals from those countries, let's say, that had to come to the United States. All of those things are very much connected to each other, and I think we don't often think about that. So, when Afghanistan, when the withdrawal happened and society completely came under Taliban control again, I was just thinking to myself, in the refugee situation that I created, my father was a Vietnam vet, and I went with my dad to Vietnam a few years ago because he wanted to go back and see what it was like. And I was just immediately reminded of, after these significant military interventions that the U.S. has, often when the U.S. pulls out, those populations have to go somewhere because those countries have been so destabilized politically and economically. And then in terms of our immigration policy, the ways in which it's racialized further puts those populations at a disadvantage. And then those people get here and experience significant racism and discrimination. And, figuring that the only way to assimilate or to become American or to succeed in this society is to resemble the white American mainstream is very, very difficult. And the reality is that, again, I think it's just a reflection of all of these processes at work and how race is a central part of that process too.
While the mic is coming down, I have a question. You made reference to the importance of providing education for young people. Since George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, a number of corporations and universities and schools have initiated education and training for their staff and employees. And I'm curious as to what you think the key elements need to be to begin to overcome a lot of the racist tendencies that exist within our universities or corporations or cities or elsewhere when you're trying to bring together adults as opposed to young people.
Absolutely. So that's a really important question. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions when people think about race and racism, the focus is on interpersonal behaviors and interactions that happen. And so this perception of, well, I'm not racist, or, I'm not treating anyone differently, or I'm not trying to do that. And so the important thing to also think about, particularly in these discussions, is for people to recognize the institutional and structural components of racism in terms of how certain populations have been excluded from access to higher education institutions, to certain professions, to a wide range of spaces, and how, again, the education needs to be around not only interpersonal prejudices that might result in discrimination at an interpersonal level, but also be thinking about the structural elements involved and why it is that certain populations have access to institutions like Northeastern or Harvard or any of the universities in the Boston area, which are quite elite, and more specifically, why the population of African American students and faculty is much lower in those institutions compared to other populations of people of color in terms of thinking about, again, the history that we've been talking about tonight. So I think there needs to be recognition of the structural piece of that, and how institutions perpetuate structural racism when it comes to things like hiring. How are hiring decisions made? How are retention issues that come up when problematic issues or discussions happen within the workplace? How do you address those? In terms of representation, if there is only one person of color or one Black or one Latinx person in a department at a university or within a company, how does tokenism play a role in shaping that person's experience? So really being able to think about multiple ways in which racism manifests itself and then trying to create solutions to reduce that structural racism within the institution. So those are just some small suggestions that I have, but certainly if I had more time, I could talk more at length about that too.
Hi. Okay, there we go. Nope, maybe not. Either way. Hi. I was curious what your thoughts are on racial categories, and I will kind of specify. So like I'm talking about like you get on when you're taking like the SAT or census or anything like that, you'll like check check the boxes kind of thing on race and ethnicity. Because you brought up the point about how like France got rid of this type of categories. Am I correct? That was France, right? Okay. And how this didn't really change anything because although race is a social construct, like it's a very much of a real thing in our societies. But also I'm just curious because it seems like these categories are also really misused in like research specifically. I'm thinking of the like medical research and how and maybe this is just lazy research and that might be your opinion, but that and maybe there's like a lack of context, but researchers seem to like to use these categories to say like being X race, being X ethnicity is a risk factor for this medical condition or homelessness, like any other social condition. Whereas like really, if you look at it, it's probably more income related. It's probably more like the social conditions we like put these people in rather than, I mean, comes down to your race. Your race has no effect on the likelihood of you being born. Like that has nothing to do with it. So I'm just curious if you think that they do more harm than good, like, because it does seem like might be useful to actually be able to figure out like who's being affected by a certain scenario. Like, yeah, I'll let you talk.
Sure. So that's a really important question. Again, it's one that I do get a lot, in terms of if we get rid of racial categories and we're going to stop asking about these things, is that the way that we get to race becoming less important in our society? And so the thing about racial classification is it's really important to think about the purposes of the classifications and who's asking. So if we're thinking about the census, that's a particular political project that the US government is engaging in for a couple of reasons. One, to be able to understand the demographics of the population in terms of, how much the US is changing every 10 years. But it also is important too for the allocation of resources. So I was talking about this in my undergrad race and migration class today about how every 10 years, those numbers are really important for determining how many representatives a district gets. And how much funding from the federal government a census tract gets. So if you have an undercount, that means less money from the federal government. And so that's one piece of the importance of the census. The other piece is too in the US, that the census has also been used for having the racial categories as a way to be able to see how racial inequality is improving or getting worse over time by being able to kind of compare across censuses on different indicators how the population looks. So that's the other important element too, in terms of why having those categories is important. I will say that the US is really unique in that the race question has been on the census every year, that the census has been taken since 1790, and every 10 years, those categories have been different. So no two censuses in the United States have had the same racial categories. And that's important too, because it also demonstrates how race is a social construction and how the categories that show up on the census are created for particular political, economic, and social purposes, depending on what's happening in the society at that time. To get to your question about the notion of racial categories and disparities around health and other social outcomes that come up, that's a really important one because I think sometimes when people, read about racial disparities and think about sort of medical research, that the perception is that, oh, well, there must really be racial differences biologically. And so that's the other piece, I think, an important part of your question. This notion of that race was once thought of as something that was biologically constructed, that these physical characteristics that look different on the outside must mean that genetically we're different from each other. So a lot of research has shown that there is no biological differences in race or terms of genetic differences. But when it comes to a lot of the medical research, that sometimes people get confused by that because, as you said, they're not focusing on the social, the economic, the other environmental factors that might be contributing to those disparities that are being picked up within the data or within the research. And so that's a really important piece, that it's not that certain populations are more inherently prone to develop a certain type of cancer or to develop high blood pressure or other type of medical conditions, but it's often connected to history and a legacy of living in neighborhoods that don't have access to good public transportation or grocery stores or clean air or an area or outdoor recreational area to be able to exercise. That those are factors built into the environment and social structures and institutions that then contribute to different health outcomes that different racial groups might have. So oftentimes people don't fully understand that connection to the social and the ecological factors, but often think that, well, it's because there are these actual racial differences between groups, that some are more predisposed to certain types of health conditions than others.
Given what you've seen of the new census data, what kinds of policy changes would you anticipate seeing in the years ahead around issues of race?
Oh, that's a really good question. So in terms of what some of the most recent demographics suggest about the 2020 census and the demographics of the United States. So the United States is certainly becoming much more diverse, and much more diverse in the sense that the population of individuals who identify ethnically as Hispanic or Latino, and notice I said ethnically because Hispanic or Latinx slash Latino is an ethnic category, not a racial category. And also the Asian American populations are seeing a huge increase demographically. And the census results also showed an increase in the number of people who identify or checked off as having more than one race, and some decreases in the populations that identify as racially white or racially Black. And so what the demographics are suggesting is that the US is becoming certainly much more diverse, and that we have to start thinking about, again, going back to the question about racial categories, what do these categories mean and what are the importance of these categories for people in their everyday life in terms of how they check off the box, but also how they're seen by other people. So in terms of thinking about policy, in terms of the increasing diversity of the United States, I think the other thing we have to think about too is around policy is more about language access. So, having more resources available for people, because we certainly have large segments of the population that English is not the primary language spoken in certain households. And in terms of thinking about people being able to access proper health care, access government resources and things like that, having language access available for this much more diverse population, linguistically diverse as well, is really important. I also think around in terms of thinking about issues of inequality with regard to housing and schooling, that policy definitely needs to continue to push for increasing, access to programs around more quality public education in terms of public schooling. How do you improve the tax base in neighborhoods that have been negatively affected by residential segregation, because that's what funds public schools, the tax bases in neighborhoods. How do you think about implementing policy to address that? Making communities safer for people and the quality of housing better. So if we think about the context of COVID, some of the communities that were hardest hit, particularly Black and Latinx communities, were tied to issues of unsafe housing, either being in really crowded situations or issues of of unaffordable housing. So, using policy to create more affordable housing, particularly for populations that are being affected by gentrification and having a really difficult time finding affordable housing. So those are just a couple of examples. Again, I could give more, but in the interest of time, I feel like those could be some really important ones.
Hi. I just don't know if this is working, but going back to what you're talking about with education and racial literacy. I absolutely agree. That's totally important. I remember last year when we were talking more about that. My mom is a high school biology teacher in Providence. Most of her students are either learning English as a second language, or they're really diverse. And so when they brought up this topic, they just handed them all a book and were like, you should discuss this in like the equivalent of your home. And my mom was like, well, this doesn't make sense. Most of these kids are not going to read a book outside of class. Half of them don't speak English. They're not going to read a book about racism outside of class. We can't even have a discussion about this. And I don't even know if I'm like equipped to have a discussion about this. So how do we have a discussion about racial literacy when teachers may not even be equipped to do it themselves, or like are maybe holding like racist ideas? How do we move forward from there?
No, I mean, it's a really big issue. And I think it goes back to your question earlier about how should institutions be responding to this moment. And I think, in terms of thinking about training, bringing in professionals, but then again, that requires additional resources. But being able to bring in professionals who can maybe do workshops around trying to have or establish a foundation around people learning the terminology, or at least getting an introduction to that, because I think it's also, if people don't feel properly equipped to talk about those topics, it can be very counterproductive to the purpose of, having students read a book on these topics if the faculty don't have the literacy to be able to effectively guide those discussions. So I definitely think more training is needed. Within various types of institutions, and various types of jobs and workplaces. And it's one of those things that shouldn't just be kind of a one-time thing, but something that needs to happen periodically over time for people to be able to become more comfortable with and more familiar with using the terms and gaining the skills or at least enough knowledge of the terminology to feel that they can engage in some discussions. Because like, as I said, I think it can be counterproductive to try to have someone who's never had to deal with those issues before or discuss them with students or with anyone else if they don't have the proper tools and the language and the vocabulary to be able to talk about those terms either in that discourse. Yeah.
I just had a question to go back to the connection you made between racism in the US and global processes. I'm wondering what you think is the importance of like global solidarity against racism and what the outcomes of global solidarity might look like, whether it be like soft power, like just international pressure, or if you see changes, excuse me, in like foreign policy towards certain countries. Yeah.
So that's a really good question. And just briefly, I think, addressing these issues globally is important or thinking about what, as you said, global solidarity would look like. But I think it's also important too in that project to really try to minimize or to not replicate the power dynamics already at play. So, in terms of thinking about the countries with more power globally, not being at the forefront of that discussion or, or allowing the countries that have less power to have more say or a role in creating that dialogue or discussing the conditions in terms of thinking about how do we address global solidarity. I think it's also important to be able to think about similarities, but also recognizing the contextual differences between how race and racism might look in different contexts. And so going back to what I was saying earlier about how in some countries, so I think about like Latin America, for instance, in my conversations with people about race and through my interview research and stuff over the years, people are like, oh, well, we didn't have a history of Jim Crow segregation, so we're not racist. And I'm thinking to myself, the fact that I'm in Brazil and I walk past a magazine stand and it looks like I'm in Europe because all of the images in media and the standard of beauty around what's attractive is very much about having lighter or whiter phenotype, and that's what's valued in the society. So, really being able to understand, again, thinking about how you can collaborate among the similarities, but also recognizing the differences, and then trying to come together in terms of building, I guess, a platform or a plan around that. And thinking about the role of, again, thinking about Du Bois, this role of capitalism and colonialism, and trying again or to if you well, it will be very difficult to minimize the impact of that. But I think that would be the goal, to be aware of how those processes of power are playing out and trying to disrupt that in order to be able to have that sort of global solidarity around recognizing commonalities and anti-Black racism on a global level, and also white supremacy on a global level and its different manifestations.
Thank you, Professor Joseph. I want to go back to Du Bois, and in particular the text, The Soul of Black Folk, where you mentioned a few of the key concepts. And I know Du Bois situates us historically in sort of the period after emancipation. And I'm curious because it's interesting to hear all of the questions oriented towards policy. But I'm wondering if you can clarify how Du Bois historically explains this tension that was created even after the fact of emancipation. And I guess I'm, in particular, I'm curious about like the Freedmen's Bureau and the failure of that.
No, absolutely. So that's a really good question. So what Guilherme is referring to is other parts of Souls of Black Folk, where he is talking about basically the failure of the U.S. government to live up to some of the policy promises that were made after the Civil War ended to try to incorporate the formerly enslaved population into the US society. And essentially, it was a failure. And that's what he actually talks about in some of the chapters of the book about the failure of Reconstruction and how the policy failures that contributed to not only the social and political, some of the progress that was made briefly after the Civil War ended in terms of thinking about that period. It was when there were the largest number of Black senators in the United States and U.S. history. There haven't been that many since then. So that brief moment, and then the compromise that was made under the president after that time to basically end Reconstruction, and also the bargain led to the rise of Jim Crow segregation or the institutionalization of it in the South as well, and how that was really important for thinking about how there was a moment when the United States could have moved forward, but actually moved backward, particularly with regard to the position of African Americans in this country at that time. The other thing I'll just mention briefly too is that you also had Supreme Court cases, so Plessy versus Ferguson happened shortly after that, which basically institutionalized and said Jim Crow segregation was constitutional. And so that's what led to, again, the institutionalization of Jim Crow segregation, which would eventually be why the civil rights movement happened, to try to undo the de jure explicit discrimination in code and in law that was sanctioned by the US government. Essentially Du Bois, is writing about the failure of policy and how that is directly related to the inability of Black Americans to improve their social mobility because of all of the social, structural, economic, and political factors working against them. All right. Thank you all so much.
Well, I want to thank Professor Joseph. Really a fascinating talk and then conversation. I think your emphasis on the international perspective was really interesting and useful for us. And also, as you say, I think we've also found that often when you bring up these issues, students will say it's the first time I've heard about it, but I think you gave us some really important context building and deeper understanding of how to talk about it when we talk about it. This theme of kind of whiteness and kind of this gravitating towards whiteness that so many societies seem to go through is also going to be our topic next week when we'll be looking at American Jews and this idea of how did American Jews become white. We're going to be bringing in two speakers to address that, and it's really a fascinating discussion of what assimilation was like for American Jews, and I think raises interesting questions about other groups that are coming to this country and whether, as Professor Joseph said, there is enormous pressure on them to sort of become white because that's kind of the standard. So we'll be discussing anti-Semitism and how Jews became white for next week. And we look forward to seeing all of you and broadcasting to people who are tuning in via Zoom. So thank you very much.